more answering. So we hope you come prepared with some questions. We have about an hour, and we're going to go over a couple of basic things to get started here. But we're just hoping that you guys have some questions. So the way it's going to work is Andrea, who's based in Denver, is going to be kind of moderating the questions and sort of feeding them to me and Joe, depending on the nature of the question, is primarily how we're going to do this. Um, so one of the things that I think we'll get started, since we've got a good crowd, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us for our webinar and Ask the Experts. We're going to try to do some more of these. And we hope that if you have some ideas of some things you'd like us to cover in this series, that you'll let us know. So again, my name is Eric Luden. I'm the founder and owner of Digital Silver Imaging. We've been here in Belmont, Mass. for about 16 years, and very excited for basically being a fine art custom print lab that focuses on high quality printing, framing for individual pieces or entire exhibitions and shows. And we've got a great team here. We are an artist run business. Everybody that works at our lab has a degree in photography. And I'm really proud that that means that when you entrust your work with us, the people with real critical eye that have a sense of their own work are going to really be focused on delivering something really that you'd be really happy and proud of. So one of the things that I want to cover first and foremost that is incredibly important, whether you print with us, print at home, or God forbid you print with somebody else, is that you are dealing with a calibrated monitor. We have been using with X-Rite, which is now called Calibrite. And I know other people use the Spider system. So the importance of a calibrated monitor, Joe is going to talk about in a second, but I will just tell you that the most common complaint we get is my prints are darker than my monitor. It is the number one problem that people experience if they don't have a calibrated monitor. Your monitors tend to burn bright. You're looking at transmissive light shining through your image as opposed to reflected light, which is how you look at a print when we send it to you. So I just can't impress upon you enough how important that is that you avoid frustration. So that's all I want to say about our introduction. Andrea, is there anything you want to add, or do we want to
Sure.
turn it over to Joe?
Well, I'd like to say that in this webinar today, we are not going to, or we can't really deal with your specific printer problem. So if you're having a problem with your printer, such as, you're getting a lot of paper jams, or, you've got a clogged head, any of those kind of mechanical, technical questions about your printer or your software interface, we cannot answer those because, we're not printer techs, and that's best answered by the manufacturer or the dealer where you purchased your printer. I think so. Having said that, Frank is our first question, and I please ask that you put your questions in the Q&A, which is, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A icon down there, and just click on that and enter your questions in the Q&A. So that it's easier to keep track of questions other than in the chat. The chat's kind of for just general commentary, and I'm going to post some things in the chat as well. One of the things I'm going to post in the chat is I've created a blog post on our website, and that blog post will have a lot of links that we're going to talk about, such as monitor calibration, etc., devices, and other links. So I'm going to post that in the chat right now. So there you go. So you can go to that link, and that's going to have other links. And it also has a special promotion where you can get 25% off and free shipping for just participants of this webinar. And that's for the first 25 customers. So don't hesitate. And it also ends this Sunday. But let's get into it. And Frank basically is helping us out by asking the perfect first question. And Frank's question is, my desktop work is done on a Mac Studio with Studio Display 5K. The monitor is well calibrated by Apple, Is there any value or need to further calibrate the monitor? Second, many Apple devices, iPads, do not expose an interface to allow calibration. Do you know of a way to calibrate an iPad? So let's take it away. I don't know who wants to field that question, Joe
Joe.
or
Yeah.
Eric.
Yeah, I'll do that. Um, so can we go back to that question about the person with the Apple monitor saying it's calibrated by Apple? Which app? So which monitor is that? Is that a built-in? Did they
It's a
specify?
Studio Display 5K.
Okay. Um, so yes, it might be calibrated when they give it to you, but that's going to always change over time. So as soon as you buy a monitor, it starts dying, like we do, right? Like things age, things change, and it starts to shift. The more it cooks, the more it's running, the more things are burning out, slower than it used to. With modern monitors, you can calibrate a lot less frequency, a lot less frequently than you used to have to. It used to be every 2 weeks, everything was totally different. Now you can go a little bit longer. I'll say once a month because that's the good practice. You can get away with a lot longer than that. So that being said, yes, you should always calibrate anyway. Um, and I don't know about that specific monitor. That one they might try to get a little closer to true. But most Apple products that you're going to buy, be it a MacBook Pro or a high-end iMac even, there's going to be too bright and too blue because that's how Apple defaults their equipment because it looks sick. It looks bright. It looks clean. It doesn't look old and dingy, but it's not accurate. So we always, like the first thing I do, is calibrate. Um, and yeah, so that being said, yes, it might be great out of the box at one time, but after a month, you want to calibrate it anyway. Um, and so so they're part of that question about built-in software, Andrea?
Yeah, so I think that what Frank is intimating is that he's used the built-in software, using the built-in software, but yeah, I know that is you do need an external device, basically.
Yeah, so what you're going to need is some kind of puck to go on the monitor, which I have mine handy, I would show you. Um, we have a very fancy one that can also profile papers, which I think we'll talk about a little later on. But you can get them for like $100. The little like something like that, a small X-Rite one. You can get a small spider one that'll stick right on with a little weight, so it'll hang over the back of the monitor. Um, but that needs to be able to talk to a software, and they all come with their own softwares that are meant to work with that. Exactly, that's tried and true. That's been around forever. Before I won, it was Color Monkey. Before that, it was something else. They all made the same thing. Um, so
I think that covers it pretty
Yep.
well, Joe, and it also
Well,
dovetails into Catherine's question,
wait, hang on.
which is, yeah, under what lighting conditions should you calibrate?
Yeah. So with that, it's going to be the conditions that you work in, right? So I'm always in the same room. I always have it darker than this, so I calibrate like this, right? If you usually work in a dark room, don't turn on all the lights and then calibrate. Um, and then yeah, so which is in the conditions that you typically work in.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So I just want to add something to that because I know there was a question there about calibrating iPads and iPhones.
Oh, right.
Those are not professional photo devices. You should be judging your prints on. You really should be working on a monitor that's on your desktop, be it a laptop, an external monitor, and that could be BenQ, ISO, Apple, something that is more geared towards the photographic realm. You can do all that research yourself. We're not going to tell you which ones to buy, but there are many good companies making great monitors. But I would not try to then, showing your images on an iPad or an iPhone or some other portable device is fine, but I would not use that to judge my photographs for a print.
So, okay, I think that we have one other question about calibration that was asked in the chat. And I want to also point out again that we have an excellent video link to calibration on that page that I just posted. And I'm going to post it again. And that goes into in depth on why calibration, how to calibrate. Also, it talks about calibrating everything from your camera to your printer if you're printing at home. So that's an excellent webinar, and it's a really great resource. And I would encourage everyone that didn't see that webinar to maybe go back and look at it. But we also have a question in the chat that says, I use a Calibrite always to tune my monitor. That's great. Um, but the screen tends to get brighter. Is there a way to freeze brightness in Mac OS? I don't think there is. Do you guys know? And I also think it's part of monitor drift that the screen
Uh,
just changes.
yeah, it could be a part of the drift. The one thing you can lock is the keys on the keyboard. So if you're sharing your computer with somebody else and they come in and go, "Why is it so dark? I can't see anything." Then you can lock it at least from the keyboard and hide it from the top bar. I don't think you can lock in the brightness from being adjusted if someone wanted to adjust it. But if no one's adjusting it and it's changing, then it could be that it's either fading, or like someone just said in the chat that there's an adaptive lighting feature, which you should absolutely turn off. That's a good point. Thank you, Michael. Um, because what that's going to do is the moment you calibrate it set a certain way, but the computer thinks that you want it to change with the ambient light, which you don't because it's calibrated at that moment. So that's a very good point, is to turn off any adaptive lighting settings in your
And the
system.
last, yep, I think the last thing I want to say on calibration for now, before we move on to about exporting files, is keep in mind that if you are on a laptop and you move from room to room to do your photo, technically you should probably be doing another calibration because, sitting at your kitchen island in the morning with morning light is going to look one way. But if you go to work in your office at nighttime with some, other lights on, your profile it will look different. And many of the devices, at least I know the X-Rite and Calibrite ones, do take an ambient light reading first before you put the device on the monitor to do the actual calibration. So that is a really important thing to consider.
Yeah, and a quick
I
note
want to
about
say
what
just
you
one.
said.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Joe.
Yeah, that's fine. A quick note about that is that is true, and the best way to avoid that is to really never have any light hitting your monitor directly, right? So don't have windows behind you, don't have lamps behind you. Um, and if you're going to do an ambient room check, I usually personally don't do those because I have a room full of windows. So that's going to always change a little bit. But if you're working in a room that nothing ever changes, then that's a great thing to do. But if you're in a room like Andrea is right now and the windows are going to change throughout the day, I would turn off that setting.
Yeah, that's why if I do any work like that, I only do it at night when it's dark out. And I also want to mention too that remember color is perceptual, which means if you have a color next to another color, it's going to change your perception of that color. So let's say you have a very bright background screen, like it's a photograph of that you love, and it's a background screen, and you're doing your post-production work with part of that background screen showing. That'll also affect the way you're basically adjusting that image. So try to use a neutral gray background or a black background if that works for you. So I think we could, so like I said, great resource in that video link that I sent on our website about calibration, but I want to keep going here. Otherwise, we could talk about calibration all day. But Andrew asks, he says, I get a blue cast to my black and white prints on an Epson Artisan 1430 6 color printer. Said I could probably do better with a printer with 2 black inks, I think. So, Joe.
Yeah. So that could be happening for a couple of reasons. And it might be a printer specific issue. So the Epson, this is going to kind of go into something that somebody asked in the chat about printing color inkjet files black and white. And that's like what color space to use and what printer settings to use. So if you're going to use paper profiles created by the manufacturer, then you want to so in both Epson and the Canon, there's a way to print black and white with like through those drivers. So in Epson is going to be called advanced black and white, unless they've changed it. Um, but so with that, it's going to translate it differently, so to speak. So it's not going to try to like force color in, and that's when you see that blue tone. It could also be if your nozzles aren't clean, so always check those before you print. Um, but if your monitor is calibrated, your file is black and white. If your file is in gray gamma 2.2, you know it's black and white because that's a grayscale file and it's still printing blue. Then you're going to want to do your advanced black and white settings through your printer driver. If you're on a Mac, make sure it's installed properly. And in your system preferences, it does not say AirPrint. If it says AirPrint, you're not getting everything from your driver, and you won't have those advanced settings.
Good
I
point.
think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe or Eric, but in general, you never want to select have printer control color. You always want to let Photoshop do that.
Yeah, Photoshop or whatever the software that you're printing from is, because in that software you're going to choose your ICC profile that either you created or you download it from the manufacturer.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. And folks, just to keep things moving in an orderly fashion, I know people are asking questions in the chat, but if you could please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you go to the little Q&A, I'm going to try to also monitor. I am monitoring the chat. So if there's something related to a current question, I'll add that on. So the next question in the Q&A is from Michael Colby, and he says, feel free to talk about workflow, proofing, and your thoughts on it says customer profiles. I think it's meant custom profiles because I know he commented on that for paper and ink. So custom profiles and workflow.
Yeah, so we love custom profiles. I make them here. It's one of those things that you also update over time. So once a year, if not twice a year, I'll make new custom profiles for every paper we have, for every printer we have, because sometimes things change in manufacturing of the paper or the inks. But more often the paper, because that's something that's, I mean, it's natural things involved, so things sometimes shift and change. Um, so as far as custom profiles, yes, they're always the best. They're kind of hard to make. You have to have a certain kind of calibrator that's also a photospectrometer that can read and scan through any charts that you make. But it's the best way to know that your screen is calibrated because that you've already done. That what you see is in a match with your paper on your printer with your inks all together as one. So that is definitely the best way to go on that.
And I think the other part of that question is a lot of people use profiles from the manufacturer and they soft proof on their monitor. What do you guys think about that practice?
Yeah, I mean that's another way to kind of know what you're going to get. Is by soft proofing. Yeah.
I will just add in a couple of things. I know that Michael has commented that sometimes the printer manufacturers' profiles aren't always spot on. And I would agree with that, Michael. I think that it's certainly better than kind of going through the printing through the print driver and selecting, let my printer control color. So that's probably what a lot of people start with. The next step would be to download the manufacturer's profiles. And the other thing, I will put a plug for our friends at Freestyle Photo out in California. They will actually create custom profiles for you. They have a thing. I think they charge $100. So if you want them to do that, you can contact Freestyle. and they will build a custom profile for you. I think they send you a file, you make a print, you mail it to them, they read it in, they send it back to you. So again, I can't say enough good things about Freestyle Photo.
So moving right along here, uh, Barry says, I'm very happy client of DSI. Well, thank you, Barry. Appreciate that. I would love to start printing my own work. What is a great starter printer to use? I was recommended a Canon Pro 100.
I'd like to answer that if I could, because um, the Pro 100 is a good printer, but I still believe that is a die-based inkjet printer, and not suitable for longevity. If you just want to get something going to make some of your own prints, that's fine. If you're limited on space and you are thinking about you want to make big prints but want a home printer to make smaller prints, I would look at the Canon ProGraph 300. That does use the same ink set that we use, or the new ProGraph. They just came out with the 1100 as opposed to the 1000. But both of those printers are pigment inks, which are the same inks we use here on our Canon printers that go up to a 60-inch printer. So if you have one of those and want to make a 30 by 40 and you've made it on one of the papers we work with, we're going to be talking a much closer language by sticking with that. I'm not going to put down Epson, but I will say that we switched over to Canon a number of years ago and I've never looked back.
Okay, so I think that covers that well. Russ asks, I've calibrated my monitor, have the correct paper profile installed. My first print to my Canon Pro 1000 is typically about 3 or 4 pulls from final print. Is this typical? What should one expect? It's a good question.
Joe?
Yeah, so it is so that can depend a little bit on what media you're using, which we can talk about. I'm sure we're gonna go in depth about this a little bit later. But if you're printing on a paper that is bright white and looks clean and like a Canson Platine or like something like that's a very bright white paper, you probably won't see that. If you're working on some some really natural rag fiber papers, you might see it start to get dark despite everything being correct. So uh, three or four 3 or 4 pulls. I'm not sure exactly the technical meaning of that. But if you're way off still, then I would check the settings and try to find a tutorial online of from the printing software that you're using and see if there's any weird settings going on that could also be causing that. But so yeah, so it's the paper that you're using that can make a big difference. One photo on 2 different papers will look drastically different, just because of the base involved. And then just double check your settings and make sure there's nothing weird going on.
Uh-huh. Um, let's see. I'm going through the chat here. I know that there was a question that's semi-related to this, but okay. So Joe asks, could you go through your printing workflow from Photoshop, not asking about post-processing of image, more the specific sequence of steps you take once you start the printing process in Photoshop? I know we discussed this before the webinar. Do we want to show that, Joe,
Yeah.
in maybe Photoshop and in Lightroom?
Yeah,
Uh,
I did. Can I just chime in with something really quick? Because this does go back to the calibration question, which I think Andrea put in our blog post. Because there is a question here about the correct light display for photo, lumens, Kelvin, and all that. So, Joe, if you do before you do the export, if you could just tell people what we recommend, and again, it is reiterated in the blog post. And then what we're going to do is have Joe do a screen share and talk about exporting a file, proper ways of exporting a file out of Lightroom and Photoshop to make a print.
yeah, sure, yeah. So also, I'm not sure if your question is about how we actually print for Photoshop, which we don't, which we use third-party software to print from, or how to get your file ready for print in Photoshop. This is going to be more of the latter. So I'm going to share my screen. Because this is a very common question that we get is not so much in Photoshop, but more Lightroom, but I will show both, both is important. So if we are going to get our file ready to print, some of the most important things need to be the color space. So I would like to go and make sure that I am in RGB color. I'm already on 16-bit. I don't need to go up. I don't need to go down. The more the merrier, but there's no reason to jump up from 16. That's a great bit depth for printing. If we were going to be a black and white print, I would go to grayscale. I keep it RGB while I'm editing because you have more, there's more channels, there's more information, there's more stuff that you're gonna get out of it. But for actual printing, you can drop it into grayscale. That's fine. And then the other part of that is going to be the actual color settings of your Photoshop, right? And the profile itself that the file is in. So I can see up on my right-hand side here in Photoshop that I'm in Pro Photo RGB. That is the biggest color space. That's where they came from Lightroom with this file, and it brought the color space with it. So Adobe RGB is what I usually go and print from. That seems to translate the best to print. But I'll do my editing in Pro Photo because that's the biggest color space. You get the most information out of it. So because it came from Lightroom with this file, it has that. Normally it wouldn't. So for changing your profile, you can go down here and you can assign the profile or convert the profile depending on what you're doing. So you can go here and you can choose Adobe RGB 98. That is the standard for color printing. And then that'll convert your file. Or you can do a full convert. This will sometimes flatten your image. So in that case, you want to always save a layered copy and then have this. Then you can go and convert right there. The last thing would be sizing. So if you know how big you want your print to be, or you could even go here and check and see, is my file big enough to print at the size I want to print, right? So if you have a phone picture, which is fine, and you want to make a massive print out of it, you can go here and check and see if that even works. The resolution that we want to print at is always, or that we print at is 300. You can get away with a 260 to 320, but 300 is that magic number. So I'll turn off free sample, hit 300. Oop, did not mean to close that. And then this is the actual size of my file at 300. It's roughly 13 by 23. So here I can go, and if you want to resize the file, because you're going to print it, or you're going to send it to us to print it. Here we can make a nice, let's go a nice even 24 inches on that. Oop, I should type what I'm saying. 24 inches on that edge. I'll let that side fall. And then I have a size file that I can print. And then from then, if you're not going to print from Photoshop, you want to save the image. I'll always save it as a TIFF. That is a large file with no compression, and it is a universal file. So any software should know what that is. You don't want to do a JPEG because that's going to compress your image, and it is not a lossless compression, so you will lose some information over time, and the more you open and close the JPEG, the more you're going to lose. So that's more or less how to do everything in Photoshop. I'm going to switch over to Lightroom. Well, this seems a little more complicated sometimes, and kind of can be, but once you get the hang of it, it's totally fine. So I'm going to take my image. I'm going to go back to my library module, rather. So I've brought it in here. I'm done my edits, so that good stuff. And then I'm going to go to the export button. And then sometimes people see this and they're like, what do I do? Or they're doing things in here that they don't realize are actually harmful for their file. Um, so I'm not going to go over too much the whole top part. That's all up to you. Like, where do you want things to save is up to you. How you want to name it, that's all you. This part here is the important bit. Um, so like I said before, TIFF files are the best. They have a no compression option, which I have on right now. I can also choose my color space of Adobe RGB, which is great, and my bit depth of 16 bits. Down here is going to be your resizing, right? So if you know that you're not going to print from Lightroom to an export at a certain size, then you can totally do that here. You can pick the long edge or the short edge or whatever and say what size you want it to be. And then you can choose a resolution for 300. So right here is where you don't want to have. So if you're gonna send us a file and you want us to resize it, that's cool. Then just turn this off and keep the resolution at 300. If this is off, this is still active. So if you have this set at 72, but you think it's turned off, it doesn't matter. That one box is still on for the resolution. So always make sure you're checking the resolution and you're putting in 300 so we have the best file we can to print from when we go and print your image. And then the rest you can ignore or choose. Don't do a watermark unless you really want one. But everything else, all metadata is all up to you, all that stuff. And then you can hit export and you can send us your file. And that's that.
Great.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just typing some stuff in. I'm updating the blog post as we're going to. So by the end of the webinar, I'll have all the links that I've been posting in the chat. So Eric, did you want to say something?
No, I think we do have all of that Joe just went through. I mean, first of all, I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded, so you can go back and rewatch this to pull up anything you want. But we do have a post on our website about proper steps for exporting out of Lightroom. So you can see that on our custom upload page. I believe everything is still the same on that. We did do that screenshot a little while ago, but I think all the settings are basically the same, even though Lightroom has made any changes. So
yeah,
it's probably be a good time, I think, to maybe try to get delve into some of these questions.
Yeah. So I think Robert just asked, he said, what's the correct light display for photo? How many lumens? What Kelvin? And that information is also in the blog post, but I'm just going to go through it really quickly. So it's D65. It's 100 candelas lumens to 120 max. We feel 120 is way too bright, especially if you're in a dark room. But so we actually recommend 100. You could use that higher luminosity if you're working in a bright room, but that's not an ideal situation for editing your work. And gamma set at 2.2. So that's also in the blog post.
I'd like to take a stab at another question that came in. First of all, I also posted everybody, and again, Michael Colby, thank you for you provided the direct link for doing the custom profiles at Freestyle. So if you want to do that, I did post that in the chat. But another question came in about printing at home versus printing with a lab. I want to say the most important thing is that you're printing. Looking at backlit images all the time on a monitor is a very different experience. If you, thank you. Pixels aren't permanent, so you know what we say. So I do believe that if you have a home printer or can get, someplace you can make small prints and make a lot of them inexpensively, just start putting them up on a wall or tacking them up or laying them on a table, really help you sort of look at your work in a different way, in a different experience. So, um, whether or not you buy a printer for yourself and want to make prints just to start looking at them, as I said, or use some online service that I know can be very inexpensive, and they offer 4x6s and 5x7s. Nothing wrong with that. I would totally encourage it. Um, if you do buy a printer, again, I'm going to say, the folks at Freestyle are better than just buying it online at some box store, because they really will support you afterwards, with questions, technical questions, profiles, paper choices. I think they're one of the best in the business. So, Michael, I think, in terms of, I, I think if you have a home printer, and, whether it's a desktop or whether it's a roll printer, obviously, if you are proficient and a technical person, it'd be like printing in the darkroom. Some people love printing in the darkroom and doing all that work themselves. Absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with that. I think that's, it can be quicker turnaround. It can be, you can do it whenever you want. You don't have to wait for shipping. Um, obviously, when it comes time to maybe doing a show or something where it's super critical, working with Joe and our team here, as I said, everybody here is an artist, and we are an artist-run business. There's consistency. There's the higher level of profile and color management that we offer. So I think, and then again, there are all the finishing options that we'll probably address in another webinar. But we can sort of do everything soup to nuts here.
Okay, so I think we need to kind of keep cranking here. So I'm going to move on to Jay's question, and I'm just going to answer it. So, and then you guys can chime in. I use a Spider Pro to calibrate, but end up having to set my brightness of my monitor level separately, darkening it up considerably. I then make a print and adjust brightness to match the print. If I send the image to a printer, such as Digital Silver Imaging, will their printer recognize my calibration? So I think, Jay, what you have to realize is that you're calibrating your monitor so that it meets a standard. You're not basically inserting calibration into your file. You're preparing your file while viewing it on a calibrated monitor. I kind of don't understand what you're saying, that you adjust brightness to match the print. But I think that doesn't sound right. And adjusting your levels of your monitor manually with a lot of monitors, that's the way you do it. So I think there's nothing wrong there. Do you guys have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes with certain softwares and monitors, you have to, while you're doing the calibration, it pops up and it says change the brightness, right? You have to go and play the fun or the world's worst game of getting that little line to hit the spot and hit the right spot, and then you go, and then it goes too far back and forth. And that's normal. It's something you have to do sometimes. Some softwares, some monitors will talk, and you can skip that part, and it'll go and automatically do it for you, based on the reading it's taking. But you shouldn't have to then brighten it up after the fact. So if you're brightening it, or so if you're calibrating and it's too dark, it may be perceived that it's too dark. But if you go and because if you're used to something normal and you go put it on right, like 90 lumens or something like that, or 100 lumens, then it looks darker than it was. But if you then go make a print and it's totally off, then yeah, that's a problem. It could come from when you calibrated. Either make sure that you calibrate your calibrator before you calibrate. Some of them will have a little thing you got to put it on to kind of like zero things out. That doesn't need to be different for each brand. So whatever your product says to do, just follow the instructions. And also making sure that that little pocket calibrator is lying flat on your monitor. When you're calibrating, they always have a counterweight that you want to throw over the other side. They always want to tilt that monitor and make sure it's flat. And then poke it and see if it moves. If you poke the back of that thing and it rocks, then it's not lying flat, and it's taking in light, and so it's perceiving that the monitor is brighter, thus darkening the calibration to compensate for light that's actually coming from the room, which shouldn't be being read at that moment. So make sure it's flat and make sure all the settings are right, and that should fix that problem.
Yeah, so there's two other questions I think that Cliff, I think we answered your question about settings. Thank you for asking. And I'm going to move on to Evan's question. Hopefully, this is kind of technical, so maybe you guys can get it. Can you please explain why some stock ICC profiles for matte papers call for both PBK? Let's see, I just lost the question here.
And MBK, was that it?
And MBK,
So,
yeah. Do you see that question, Eric?
yeah, so the question that they're asking is why, or the first part of the question is why do some paper or some profiles call for a photo black or matte black on a matte paper? And that's purely because some people like to use a photo black ink on a matte black paper. It looks different. It absorbs differently. It's a personal preference. So what they ended up doing was building a profile for both people. The ones that want to do it with the matte ink on the matte paper, or the ones that want to look a little funky by doing a photo block on a matte paper.
Yeah.
So that's why you're seeing that. It's not a mixture of the two inks. It's one versus the other, typically. So when we create our own profiles, do we just need a mixture of the two inks? No. So we're going to use the ink specified for that specific type of paper. So if it's a matte paper, it'd be matte black. If it's photo black, it'd be photo black.
I think that pretty much answers that question, Joe,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
Joe Goodman asks, any specific tips about printing black and white? I'm going to throw in my own preference right here, which is I really think that the Nick Silver Effects plugin is an awesome way to process your images for black and white. How about you guys?
Well, I will ask a question. I'm not sure what's up with Nick at this point, but is that still an active, like being updated program?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's it's owned by somebody else, bought it whose name I can't think of.
Okay. Because last I knew it was kind of getting shafted.
Yeah,
That's
Google owned it
bad,
and
but
then
it
they
is a cool
sold it.
software for sure.
Yeah.
It is a third-party software. So you have to, there are ways to integrate it into Photoshop and Lightroom, which is super cool. You can hit it like a filter to bring you open to the software. Really cool if you want to emulate certain film looks, which is very fun. Some people love that. Yeah, so Nick software is definitely one way to do it. The other tips for black and white printing, I mean, I'm sure Eric is dying to say print silver here. But for inkjets, yeah, the tips for black and white, some of it's going to be to make sure that you're using the advanced black and white settings on your driver. So it's sending black and white information and not trying to compensate with a color. And then the other thing, which is not so much technical, but more just like artistic, is, yep, see, there's Eric with his big silver yellow can print.
Big silver print.
The other thing is to keep in mind that there's no color, right? So when you're printing color, that's majority of what we're working with is color and value. So with black and white, you really want to focus on the values of certain areas of the image or the contrast of certain of the whole image or certain areas. And I think working selectively in areas of your print is the best way to make a black and white print. So it's like dodging and burning in the dark. And if one part is bleeding into another part, then like dodge an area, burn an area. But now we just do that in Photoshop with adjustment layers or Lightroom with brushes. So the localized tips.
That's a good point. I'm gonna Salima, I'm gonna skip your question. I'm gonna come back to it next, and I'm gonna move on to James's question, which is at some point, can you talk about third-party printing software like Quadtone RIP? I don't know how much do you know about that stuff, Joe?
I don't know Quadtone RIP. We use two here. We're transitioning from one to another. We do use Canon printers, so there is a Canon software that is rip and print software. The rip part tends to leave some desires, but the printing part is fine. So what they're asking about for people who don't know what that means is they most or James most likely wants to print multiple things at once, right? So how do you print on a roll of paper with multiple images? That's really the best time to use a rip. Um, so we use image print. That's the one that we are transitioning to from the Canon software. And they're great if you want to print more than one thing at once, or you really want to have a full control over your borders and stuff like that. Some of them have some more built-in settings that are helpful. A lot of some of them, image print has a black and white mode similar to the advanced black and white modes in the Canon drive or the printer drivers that you guys use. So that's also something to look for. They can be expensive, so if you don't need it, then it's not something that everyone needs to be printing from.
Yeah,
But
I think a rip is for
yeah,
kind of a high production environment
yeah.
where you're dumping a whole bunch of files into a bunch of printers, and it helps you facilitate that workflow. So if you're, if you're not in that kind of environment, I don't think you really need a rip. So moving back, Joe, I'm just kind of trying to keep things rolling here.
Mhm.
Um, so how do you make a custom profile for an Epson paper for a Canon printer?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think
Um,
you either have to buy the hardware yourself, which is an X-Rate product that costs I think somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000, or you go to Freestyle with the link I posted, and they'll make you one.
yeah.
So let's keep moving here. Actually, I got to address this question. So Eric, go get that silver print again, would you? So in the chat, Joe asked, not our Joe, Joe Goodman asked, what is silver print? Um, I don't know if he's talking about a software product, or we make real silver gelatin prints directly from your digital
Somebody asked
file.
for it.
So we use a laser to expose real light sensitive photo paper with your digital image, and then it gets processed in photochemistry in a big processor. Is a processor visible from where you're at, Eric? So um, that's
That's it.
that's the processor. That's where the film goes through. That big room in the back is where the film your file
Paper
gets
gets
exposed
exposed, not
onto the
film, but
paper.
paper. Sorry, Andrea.
Your paper. So yeah, thank you. So, but we're talking about inkjet printing today, but I couldn't resist but plugging our black and white product.
Yeah.
So on to the next question. So Joseph asked, still curious about black and white workflow for file printing. Do you prefer black and white files to be gray gamma monochrome or stay as a neutral RGB headed to print? We create custom black and white ICC profiles and are comparing them with advanced black and white through Canon and Epson and trying to decipher the ideal workflow to teach students. Currently seeing more neutrality in the custom black and white ICCs versus the printer black and white drivers.
Yeah. So to answer that question, if you are going to be teaching students, then teaching to make profiles. That's amazing. The more people that know how to do that, the better. It's always going to be better than whatever's built in to the Canon or Epson softwares. They're also going to be using Canon and Epson paper for their tests, which have their own problems. Um, but yeah, so making a custom ICC profile is always going to be more neutral. Um, for printing, yeah, so I don't personally make my files gray gamma before I print. I keep them in Adobe RGB, and then use the custom profiles that we use, and then it gets all translated out that way. So I keep them in RGB just because it is a bigger file, is a bigger color space than gray gamma. Um, But yeah, so to answer your question, the custom profile is always going to be better, and that should negate any issues about color space.
Okay, great question here coming in from Michael. It says, can you talk about using a service such as DSI versus printing at home when using a pigment ink Canon or Epson printer, and how and why to decide on which, and the economics of having prints done out of house by a service versus printing at home, paying for consumables like ink, owning the printer and paper, etc.
Yeah, Andre, that's that. I kind of touched on that before because I'm trying to answer Michael's question. So I think we covered that one earlier.
Okay, but I think it's also important to say that, I think that a key factor that I don't think you covered, Eric, is how much are you going to be printing? So if you're not using that printer frequently, you're going to start to encounter issues with the printer like clogged print heads. And, basically, you're going to be paying for a lot of very expensive ink replacements and head cleaning and or maybe even replacement if you're not using that printer fairly frequently. And fairly frequently, from my experience with the Epson printer that I just had to throw away, which really pained me, was at least, I would say,
Once a week.
every once a week. Yeah.
2 times a week. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that'll vary somewhat by manufacturer. I'm not surprised to hear that story, Andrea. But yeah, so but that's totally right, is you have to use it all the time for it to be worth your while, or you're going to be spending money uh, cleaning nozzles. And when you clean nozzles, you send in ink through them. Ink is super expensive. It's one of the most expensive liquids you can buy, um, if you do the math. So yeah, so it's great if you're going to always use it and you make a lot of small prints, and then you want to come to someone like us to make larger prints. And you know that we use the same printers or the same lines of printers and similar inks. Then that's great. But you have to be using it all the time to keep it up and running. And they are getting better than they used to be, but it's still a concern.
Okay, so moving on to Gina. She asks, and Gina, we might need some clarification on this. Gina says, when the output is dye bond, what should I be conscious and cautious of when creating and exporting? As in, how off or on will the colors be creating in Photoshop?
So I'm going to answer that if I could, because we don't offer direct printing to dye bond. We do offer making a fine art print, and which you can then choose kind of what the texture of the paper is and all that, as opposed to printing onto a very dense, rigid substrate. Um, so so we would make a print and then mount it to dye bond. There are some places that do direct dye bond printing. Again, probably more of a commercial application than a fine art application. My opinion. Hope that answers your
Okay.
question, Tina.
Yep. So Joe has a question, which I think is a good one. If one edits in Lightroom, is there an advantage in printing out of Photoshop?
So I love this question, and half the chat is gonna hate my answer, and half of it's gonna love it. But they are the same thing. The people will say that Photoshop's better, Lightroom is better. It's the same. It's the same stuff under the hood. It's a different layout. You have all the same settings. Some people find it easier to find and do what you're trying to do in one versus the other. And it isn't a change based on your workflow and why you're printing. But all the settings you can find in both, with the exception of ganging up multiple images on one is way easier to do in Lightroom. But for the actual print settings, they are the same. So it's whatever works best in your workflow. If you're in Lightroom, leave it in Lightroom. If you want to go to Photoshop, that's great. But they're both
Mhm.
equally as great.
Yeah. So I'm just going to add a couple things that we've passed in the chat and in the questions, which is yes, this is being recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel. And you'll get a notification via the follow-up email if it's up there by then. Someone also mentioned the fact that, and I can't remember who, so forgive me for that, but apropos of printing on paper, especially if you live in a really humid environment, that first sheet of paper coming out of your box might have a higher humidity content than the sheet of paper below it. So that could also make a difference in what your prints look like. Um, I think, let's see. Charles says, if your calibrated monitor covers RGB and you're printing in that color space, is there any advantage to doing your editing in ProPhoto color space? And I think, Joe, you kind of touched on this earlier.
Yeah, it's purely just the size of it. So it's a larger color space. So if I'm so the raw file, the color, there's more colors in the space. If I'm doing like really fine tuning color stuff, then there's just more information there. Without the time to edit. So that's the only reason why.
Yeah. So, and for those of you who a lot of these questions are just kind of going over your head, I really suggest you go to our link and watch that monitor calibration video. Brenda Hipscher did that presentation for the Seven Foundation, and she goes over all this stuff like color space, how do they differ, calibrating your camera, your printer, your monitor, what that means and how it is. Um, and so Cindy, it was a 3800, the printer I threw away. So, okay, moving on. Do you recommend or not printing directly from Lightroom? I think we covered that. Um,
Brian Unwin
all
asked
right.
a good question about
Yeah.
resizing software. And Brian is local and he works for Leslie University. So, I mean, I'm comfortable answering part of that, and I'm going to ask Joe to either um, completely tell me to shut up or not. But my feeling is that when I have looked at some of these resizing softwares, that things look pretty good on a monitor, but they tend to produce more digital artifacting than just utilizing the tools out of Photoshop. Like I'm a big fan of their newer software called Super Resolution, which is good for upsizing older files. But so I am not a big fan of, like, I think it's Topaz, or you asked about On One, but um, I, Joe, I want your opinion on this.
Yeah, I haven't used all the softwares that are out there. I know some people love Topaz, and that's great. I haven't used it, so I'm not going to speak on it. If if someone's used it and they want to throw in the chat that they like it, that's great. Um, but yeah, I mean, if so, thinking the Photoshop um, engine that they use to resize images has gotten so much better than it was, 10, 15 years ago. I don't know if you always need those softwares. And the super resolution is also great that Eric mentioned because it'll basically enhance your image so it's twice as big without dropping any quality or adding any pixels or doing anything like that. Um, so
That There
yeah,
is a good video, not by Katrin Eisman, but the other woman who works for Adobe that I can't think of her name all of a sudden. But if you just Google Adobe Super Resolution on YouTube, you'll find her video. You can only do it once. Don't try to do it multiple times.
yeah,
That is, apply
Um,
the super resolution more than once. So make the
yeah,
file bigger, then make it bigger again.
yeah. I mean, I all I'm going to say is I think this is where I actually like what AI is doing for photography, utilizing the Adobe engine and some of the AI tool, some of the AI that's built in for doing what we're talking about. I think that's a way that Adobe is utilizing a good side of AI.
So I'm going to skip over a couple of questions in the chat, and I apologize for that, but I feel that it's already kind of ground we've already covered. Um, so this is a quick one. So Ruth asks, she has a 3880, but she needs a new printer. I would definitely recommend the Canon ProGraph 1000 to replace that printer without a question. Mostly for the reason that I think it's a better designed piece of equipment, having had a 3800, which was very similar to the 3880, and also because it has replaceable heads. So I think that is a quick answer to that. Um,
I agree.
said, Leanne asks, in order to get good prints, I often have to create a separate file with increased saturation. Is this typical?
That might come down to, again, the calibration of your monitor and some of your print settings, or what you consider a good print. Um, so if your screen is dull or dark and it's not really showing you all the colors, or it's too bright, so you think everything looks super punchy when it doesn't. So when you go to print, things looked, not as you expected on the screen or however you're viewing it. That could be why. Or it could be that you just love a punchy image, which is great. So do I.
Yeah.
So then, in that case, it could be that. But I bet you it's more of a calibration issue that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. So Patricia says TIFF is the best file type, but DSI requires JPEG files, correct? Is there a way to upload TIFF files instead? So I'm going to answer that question. So Patricia, we have two ways basically that we print. We have what we call our direct to print service, which we used to call value print, and we have custom printing. Our direct to print service uses an online ordering interface. So basically, you do all the cropping, all the selection, and basically we just get the file with all the directions, and it goes right through our print queue. And somebody like Joe or another one of our techs doesn't open up that file and look at it. To use that, that only works with a JPEG. If you send a file to us for custom, then we prefer a TIFF. You could also send us a PSD if you really wanted to. Some people say, can I send you a raw file? I don't know why you would do that, because then that gives all the control to us. But yeah, you could send us almost any file type to custom. So we have those two different services. Our direct to print service, which gets you a little bit of a discount when you use that, because we're not doing a lot of the hand holding there, and our custom service, which is a kind of our soups to nuts service. So there you can send us any file. So I hope that answers that question. So moving right ahead, there was another question here. Let's see. That was also Max asked, what's the difference in quality in DSI direct to print versus custom? And there's really no difference in quality because it runs on the same printers. We use the same profiles that Joe's created for all the papers. So the quality is exactly the same.
It's just the options that you're given and the process is different.
Yeah. So Adam asked I'm going to answer this one really quick too, can you explain the laser versus traditional optical light print? So on our black and white, the DSI digital silver print, the real silver gelatin print, just think of it this way: is the laser kind of works like an enlarger, except it moves back and forth. It's not like a direct projection print like on a dark room. So I hope that answers that question. And here's a good question that we haven't really hit on. And we have a whole webinar on papers that I also linked to in that. But can you recommend a paper that would enhance a photo that I would print to look like an old-fashioned sepia warm tone pictorialist style, something with a little texture? I'm thinking of Steichen Flatiron Building. I can print up to 13 by 19. I think you guys know the paper or papers.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. So, yeah. So if you want a little bit of texture and you want something that's going to hold your blacks and your colors really well, I love the Honeymeal Agave. It is from their natural line. So it is made of 70% agave fibers. Yep, and it has it right there. So it uses less water and a faster growing resource to make, but also I just think it looks really cool. It holds colors well, which some matte papers kind of lose. And it holds blacks really well. If you don't want to use agave, you can use bamboo. It's in their same line, very similar. And then if you want something 420 friendly, then you can use hemp. They're hemp paper, and I think it's also they're all three of them are great. The Beretta runs a little bit warmer. So if you're doing sepia, that might be, sorry, not the Beretta, the bamboo is a little bit warmer. So if you're doing a sepia stuff, that might be something that'll interest you. but the other two are nice white bases with a fine texture, nothing too crazy.
Yeah. So Robert asks, and I think, this is a great way to close out our program today, is third-party inks, good or bad? Opinions.
I will
Bad.
chime in first. Um, Only that I'm a big proponent of trying to stick with a more closed loop system. So you've got a printer under one you manufacture, then you've got an ink under another manufacturer and a paper from somebody else. There's a lot of finger pointing that can go on there. Unless you're really good at like building custom profiles and doing things like that, I personally would not want to introduce a third party ink. If you are familiar with the gentleman up at Inkjet Mall who does the PAsography system, John Cohn, I do believe that John Cohn's out of the third party inks out there are probably the most interesting and the best that you could look at um, because he kind of does he's a real hands-on guy. And so if you were looking at third party inks, they'd probably be the only ones I would trust. Would be John Cohn, Cohn Editions, and I think his company used to be called Inkjet Mall, but I'm not sure if that's what it's still called.
I don't think Inkjet Mall is a distributor, Eric, so I think they might have distributed it.
Well,
Um,
Inkjet Mall was his company that was selling all of the
yeah,
at
yeah,
one point was selling all of his products.
yeah. Um,
But Cone
so
Editions inks, that's my answer.
yeah,
Joe, do you have
okay.
anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. But if you are going to do it, make sure that you buy the same third-party inks every time. And really, every time you buy a set, you should be recalibrating every single time or
Yeah,
reprofiling because you don't know is are their standards the same as Canon's
Yeah.
or Epson or
So,
whomever.
so here's, I think we can answer one more question. And then I think um, I just want to remind everybody that I'm going to post the link to our Ask the Experts webinar links and right here in the chat. So I just reposted that. So please go there. There's a lot of really good stuff there. And there's also our 25% off special on printing with us. So if you'd like to make a print, you can get it for 25% off up till Sunday. And the first 25 customers only. So don't take a lot of time thinking you should process your ink. Plus, I also have to say, it's very important that you just print. Can you guys see that?
those shirts are
Um,
available too. Yeah,
yeah,
we will send to both attendees and people who registered. You will get a follow up email from us um, with a link to the video. That will be done by tomorrow, and then a link to the blog post and to the how to do the promo. So um, I just want to thank everybody for spending
well,
time with us today.
hold on. Don't log off
Yep,
yet, Eric. We got
I'm
one
not
more
going to log
question
off.
that I promised to answer from
Yeah,
Paul. So he wants to know how to prepare his black and white film scan for our DSI digital silver gelatin print without buying too much sophisticated gear, says Paul. And the answer to that is,
you could
Eric?
send us your we could send us your film. We have a great system here for digitizing film. It uses a phase one medium format camera, and each capture is at 150 megapixels. So that is and if you go onto our website, maybe Andre, you could put a link in there about our digitization process. Um,
Sure.
you can get the cost down. It rivals the drum scan. It's better than an Imicon, or definitely better than a flatbed, and it's a really really very cool service that
And
we
if
offer.
you're scanning it yourself, Paul, I just want to say, just make sure you have a calibrated monitor, and uh, do that again in Adobe RGB 1998. You can do it as an RGB file. Don't do it as a monochrome because that process only prints in black and white. So even if there is a little color cast in your image, it's just going to print straight neutral tone black and white because it is a true black and white process. So You don't need any sophisticated gear, just monitor calibration. And I know you can buy a monitor calibrator right now from Calibrite for $99. So everybody should do that. It's a no-brainer.
All right. So I just want to
So I
thank,
think that's it.
yeah, I just want to thank Joe for your time and all of the experience, uh, and, wealth of knowledge that you bring. I think Andre and I have been in this industry since the 80s. So you're looking at like 80 years of experience. And Joe ran a digital department, one of the New England School of Photography. So you're looking at people who really care about their craft. We're all into photography and appreciate your time and attention. So we will look forward to another email and another webinar. And if you have some ideas about what you would like to ask the experts, please let us know. And on that note, take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your week and a nice weekend coming up.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye
everybody.
bye.